In this second presentation of Biochemistry Abridged, I'm going to be asking the question, what is biology? Now, the reason I'm doing this is because I talked about biochemistry in the first presentation as being classified as sort of an intersection of biology and chemistry, so I thought it'd be good to look at the broader subject of biology. Now, this is a very, very basic coverage of biology, and hopefully by the end you'll begin to see possibly where biochemistry starts to become its own thing, separate from biology. So the Wikipedia definition of biology is the natural science that studies life and living organisms. So that's very clear that it's talking about living things. And a few sort of core concepts, whilst biology is a very broad subject, you can talk everything from ecosystems to individual organisms. You can talk about how organisms have changed over time. And as biochemistry does, you can talk about the chemical processes. But some elements that are unique about biology, or rather I should say ubiquitous about biology, is that you have a basic unit of life, which is the cell, whether the organism exists as unicellular, so single cells, or multicellular, so lots of cells bundled together. The individual units of this living thing is the cell. Then within the cell, the gene being the basic unit of heredity or inheritance. So the gene is the unit which describes a piece of essentially the instructions to make another member of that species. So the gene is the basic instruction in a wider book of instructions known as the genome. Evolution is essentially the mechanism by which species change, which sometimes creates new species in the process of speciation. And sometimes the evolutionary pressures, so the external stimuli and factors, actually mean that certain species aren't well adapted to their environment and will go extinct. Now, an interesting definition that Erwin Schrödinger came up with after he left physics to go and work on biology. You probably know Schrödinger more from the Schrödinger's cat thought experiment, but he defined organisms or life as essentially a system which utilizes energy to resist the natural drive to entropy, or an entropy being the measure of disorder. Now, elements like the cell, the gene, what the organism is, and the actual concepts of energy and entropy I will touch on in later videos. In this video, I will talk about more specifically organisms, but the rest I'll take the time to break down in a bit more detail. So when I ask what is living, I'm not really asking about the meaning of life in a sort of human existential way. What I'm talking about here is what are the characteristics that are sort of shared across organisms and living things. Now, in school, you might have come across, at least in the English language, you would have come across Mrs. Gren or Mrs. Nergd, depending on who taught it. But this is an acronym for the elements of living things. So the first one is movement, which is that living things tend to have some sort of movement. Now, this could be something which is entirely autonomous, or could be something like the single cell, where it sort of moves and is influenced more by the environment, but it exhibits some sort of movement. Respiration. Now, this is sort of linked to nutrition later on, but this is a process of turning foodstuffs into an energy source. So you probably have come across this in the main context of turning glucose into oxygen, but it's generally the process of turning foodstuffs into energy or intermediate energy molecules. Sensitivity describes the fact that living things can detect stimuli from the outside environment. So in humans, we have our hearing, we have our sight, smelling, tasting, and the kinesthetic senses of touch, as to name a few examples. All species exhibit some sort of growth. Again, the timescale will vary. So, for example, in humans, this can happen from being an embryo to a fully grown adult, happen over a long time. Or in the case of the cell, it can happen in a matter of minutes or hours. All species have some means of reproduction, and this could be sexual reproduction, which requires a partner of the opposite sex, or asexual, which doesn't. Now, on Pixabay, which I use for a lot of the copyright-free images, I didn't really want to search reproduction, but I thought I would anyway, just to see what it would come up with. I thought the most tame image would involve some eggs, which is quite fitting to the image of the birds. So just making sure that this doesn't get flagged with inappropriate content. Similarly for excretion, which is the act of the removing of waste products. Now, living things do generate waste products, and it just doesn't mean like what we do as excrement. It could also be the individual molecules that form into these waste products. that those sorts of things could be everything from the molecules to the collective term of waste. And again, like I didn't really want to put excrement in terms of visual images in this presentation. And the last one I talked about a little bit, which is nutrition, which is that organisms require foodstuffs. Now, in the case of something like photosynthesis, this is where a plant or a photosynthesizing organism can utilize energy to make food stores. But generally, nutrition refers to the fact that either organisms need to find food sources from different sources. So this is what's called heterotrophy. And generally, as an example, humans are heterotrophs, so we have to rely on something else to give us food. Where food can be produced by the organism itself, that's called autotrophy. So I've talked about organisms a little bit and just sort of touched on the word. And these organisms are generally, a general definition of which is the things that imbibe the properties of life. So the things that, if something kind of carries the properties of life, generally that's an organism. And I touched on the fact that these can be multicellular. So animals and plants you're probably all somewhat familiar with. And some fungi are multicellular, but also creatures like yeast fall under the category of unicellular. So these are the microorganisms. And again, I'm being very general here. So there are unicellular organisms which exhibit the characteristics of plants, and as I said, yeast technically are under the kingdom of fungus, but they are themselves unicellular. Other unicellular organisms include protists. So these are kind of sort of wacky organisms, and I'll talk about some of the differences between cells in a future presentation. But the protist that people probably have heard of is all the different types of amoeba. Bacteria, you might have heard of in terms of infectious diseases, but these are unicellular organisms. And archaea. Now, archaea are a bit of a funny term, and this is something that didn't come about until the middle of the 20th century in terms of a proper definition. So they exhibit some characteristics of archaea, and they exhibit characteristics of other higher unicellular organisms. And I will touch on the differences amongst these different cell types in the future. Now, talked about bacteria in terms of infectious diseases, and you probably have also heard of viruses in terms of infectious diseases, but because viruses don't really have the machinery to replicate themselves without the use of a living cell, they're not technically classed as organisms because they're not themselves alive. They don't really exhibit movement unless just by the medium in which they inhabit. And as I said, they need to hijack another organism in order to actually utilize the living machinery inside of the organism to build more viruses. The last slide I want to talk about in this presentation is the scale of biology. Now, there's a term in mathematical standard order or standard form which writes large numbers or small numbers rather than as the number with lots and lots of zeros potentially, as it writes it as n, which is a small number between 1 and 10, but still less than 10, times 10 to the power of something else. And this is quite useful for having a concise way to measure the very big and the very small and everything in between. And so to look at the ranges of the organisms and the fields of study within biology in terms of scale, the biggest is roughly in the tens of meters. So, for example, the longest blue whale was recorded to be, that should be 10 to the 1 actually. So 22.9 meters, not 229 meters, that should be a 1. And the minimum here, in this example, a molecule of glucose, is in the picometer scale. And so if everything in between, you have your meters, your nanometers, micrometers, millimeters, and then picometers, and not in that order. But this starts to show you kind of the specific breadth in terms of the size of stuff that biology covers. And with that in mind, we're going to then go look at the other component next time, which is chemistry.